As we're nearing the end of our Ember Animated course, I thought it'd be fun to apply some of the lessons we've learned to one of EmberMap's pages. So today we're going to add some animation to our podcast page. So I'm running EmberMap locally, but we're proxying to our production backend. So here's kind of the latest podcasts. And the way this page works is we basically have this grid of podcasts. And when you click on one, you are taken to the podcast page. And so what I want to do is add some animation. So when we click on these, the poster kind of zooms in to the final location across routes. So let's start working on this. The first thing I want to do is come to our podcast pod here. And here we have kind of our index route. And here we have the episode detail route. And so in this index template, we'll see down here that we each over our episodes and we render a podcast card. And this is a component right here that contains all the rendering for each one of these cards. So let's go ahead and wrap each one of these in an animated value, and we'll pass in the episode here as the predicate. Close that off, and we'll use this .transition. And similarly, I want to come to the episode detail page here, and basically I want to wrap the image part of this template with an animated value as well, because that's our target. So this whole movie player and these video controls is rendered here in this UI Video Hero component because it's reused elsewhere on the site. So if I open UI Video Hero template, we'll see we have some markup here. If the video is coming soon, we render a message. If you can't watch the video, we render a message. But if you can watch the video, then we go ahead and render this video player. So why don't we come here and wrap this in an animated value, just like we did the card on the home page. And we'll close off this animated value. And right here, instead of episode, this is called video. So we'll just pass that video model in. And let's come here and define a transition method in this component. We can put it right here. And it's a generator. And we'll log this. This is coming from the detail page. So this is usually how I like to start, just to see what I'm working with. We'll go ahead and log every time this transition's run from here. And then back in our index template, this is also pointing to transition on the local context, which is the controller. So let's go ahead and add the same thing here. And this is coming from the index. So we'll save this. And if we come back to the app, start out on the podcast page here, and let's go ahead and open up the console. And now if we click on one of these episodes, we see that our detail transition is firing and we have one received sprite. So that is matching the model across the routes. And if we were to go back, we would see the index route transition is firing and that has one received sprite as well. So that's matching as well. And just like we discussed in the series, the reason when we go from the index page to a detail page, we only see the detail firing is because in our index template, we're not using final removal on this animator. But that's okay. In this case, I think it's going to be enough for us to just animate the receiving side over here. So because the detail has a received sprite, that means we can come back to our Video Hero component in our transition. Let's go ahead and destructure received sprites. And for each one of these, for each sprite, we're going to want to resize the sprite and move the sprite. So let's come up and import resize from Ember Animated Motions Resize, as well as move. And let's just come and see what this looks like. All right, so let's go back to the index page and click on the podcast poster. All right, well, there was a lot going on there. Let's come back to the index, slow this down a little bit. And it looks like this thing is moving, although there's no room in the detail page. The content is taking up space. So that tells me that we forgot an animated container. Let's come to our heroes template. And right here where we're going to be animating this in, let's wrap this in an animated container. And we'll just close this out. And now with any luck, if we slow this down and click on one of these podcast episodes, now we kind of have room for our poster to grow into. And so all the rest of the content isn't flashing. So that's pretty cool. Now the next thing I'm noticing here is if we start on this, scroll down a little bit and look, there's a bunch of black space here. And if I go back to the index page, The way I like to diagnose these kinds of issues is to start out on paused and click on this and just check the initial state. And it looks like the initial state of our poster is taking up too much space here. And if you look at the space of this entire thing, it looks a lot like the space of this whole card on the intro. And we really only want the image to take up the space of the image, not of the image plus the text. So if we come back and look at our index template here, we see we're wrapping our entire podcast card with our animated value. And so that's what the animation is using to set its initial bounds. But we really only want this part of the card, not this whole thing. So I think what would make this easier is if this podcast card could kind of decompose itself and maybe yield building blocks, which comprise the card in total. And that would let us basically wrap only the part we care about with an animated value. So what might that look like? Well, maybe this podcast card could go ahead and yield a card, and then we could render out two contextual components. One would be the card's image, and then the other would be the card's body. So this might be card.image and card.body. And then we'd be able to wrap the image in our animated value and then just render the body like this. So I think this API would be really nice. Let's save this and build it out. So I'm going to pop open my podcast card template. And right here I can see we have this aspect ratio component which renders the image. So this is kind of the actual image. And then background white, padding 3, this is kind of the body right here. So these are the two components that we want to make. So let's go ahead and extract this. We'll delete that. We'll drop an image template right here. Just paste this code in here. And this needs the episode. So now right here we can render the podcast components, podcast card, podcast image. And we'll go ahead and pass in the episode as an argument here. So episode equals episode. Let's go ahead and save this and see how that looks. All right, looks good. And we can do the same thing for the body. So we'll render a body passing in the episode. We'll just grab all this, come here and create a body. And we'll paste in the body code here. And it looks like everything's working. So now what we can do is check if the caller is calling this component with a block, which in this case we are. So if has block, then we'll go ahead and yield. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and render these two right here. So that way, if anyone else is using this podcast card, we're not going to break their usage of it. But in the case where we're calling with a block, we basically want to yield these two building blocks. And we can do that with the hash helper. And the hash helper will yield out two contextual components, the first one being the image and the second one being the body. And the image is going to be a component, podcast, components, podcast card, image, and we'll go ahead and pre-wire the episode here. And same with the body, that will yield out the body component we just created. And with any luck, if we come back to our index page, we'll see our cards are still rendering. But now we have, a little more control. And for example, if we kind of hid this body right here, we should just get the images being rendered. So that's kind of cool already that we have a little more usage and flexibility with this component. But we don't want to hide the body. We just want to wrap this image with animated value. And so now if we pause the animation and we click here to start, well, now we see that the image is actually the right size. And if we speed this up to 100%, then we see the posters are animating across routes. Now we're just animating when we go from the index page to the detail page, and that's all we're going to do in this video. But we can see that, it's kind of working. So this is pretty fun. Now I think the next thing that would improve this animation would be if we fade in the other elements in the page, because right now everything kind of comes right in and you see this big kind of black background and the toolbar and everything, but we actually want to fade all that in. So let's start with just this text right here. When we kind of start on an index page and we click a poster, we want this text to fade in. So back on our detail page right here, we see we render the video hero, and then here we render kind of a container, and we have the actual title and episode number and the EmberMap podcast. So this is all the code that's corresponding to this part of the page. So let's just come up here and wrap this entire thing in an animated value. And we'll pass in the model here, and we'll come all the way down to the bottom of the page, and we'll close off animated value. Now for this animator, we want to point to a new transition. Let's just call it fade. So we need to define what this is. So let's go ahead and drop a controller in here. And we'll create a fade transition. So let's console.log fade right here and just see what we're working with. And now if we start out on the index, click a poster, there we see fade is being triggered as well. It has two sprites actually, because if we come look at the template that we used, we actually kind of have two sibling elements right here that are children of this animated value, but that's okay. We can make it work with that. Now I'm passing in model here, and we see that these are both receive sprites. We could also choose not to pass in anything here, set initial insertion to true, and then we would receive these as inserted sprites. But the issue there is, let's say I was on the home page and clicked on one of these podcast cards right here. Well, if I haven't built that transition yet to go from the home page to here, now these are going to fade in and it might be a little strange. So receive sprites is a good way to know that we're coming from a page with an animator. So it's a way to kind of guard against unwanted transitions. So we have two receive sprites. So let's go ahead, come to our controller, and we'll destructure these from the arguments list, received sprites. And for each sprite, we actually want to call fade in on the sprite. So let's import fade in from Ember animated motions opacity. And let's save this and just give it a look. If we click on a poster, well, it didn't look like anything faded in. And the problem here is that because we are working with receive sprites, Ember Animated is going to start all of these elements out at full opacity since they existed in some form on the previous page. But we actually want to fade these in from 0. So what we can do is go ahead and get each one of these sprites, call apply styles on it, and we'll just set the opacity to 0. And then when we call fade in, we need to make sure to say this should go from 0 to 100, because by default, this is going to be working off the initial state of the sprite, which again is going to start off at 100% opacity. So let's see if we force the opacity to be 0 and then fade it in from 0 to 100. We go ahead and see what this looks like. So we'll go back and start off on our podcast page. Click a podcast, and well, that looks interesting. And I think again, here we forgot to drop in an animated container. So let's go ahead and wrap all of this with an animated container. Now back in Chrome, we click a poster. All right, well, now the sprites are fading in, but there's definitely something weird going on. And it looks like their position is wrong. They're fading in, but their position is wrong. And again, that has to do with the fact that we're using received sprites here, which have a natural starting point. They're trying to find the starting point of the sprite that's being sent, which in this case is this right here. But for this transition, we actually don't care about movement, right? We just want those sprites to just snap to their final location and then fade in. And so in addition to calling apply styles here, we need to go ahead and call sprite.move to final position. So let's try adding that and seeing what happens. Now if we click on a poster, all right, this is looking a little bit better. Let's slow this down and see what happens. So we get the movement there. We do see the text being faded in, but this footer kind of jumps up. And then when things kind of finish, we see more jumping. And the jumping is usually a sign that we're forgetting a container somewhere. And indeed, if we come back to our episode template, we wrapped all this content in an animated value, which removes it from the DOM, but there's content that depends on it. So we need to go ahead and add an animated container right here. Close this off and save that. Now, if we go back to our podcast page and click on a poster, we're still seeing a little bit of jumping, but we don't see the footer anymore. So the footer is where it's supposed to be, but the content is still jumping. So the final culprit here is sometimes margin collapse. So if we kind of refresh on this page right here and just inspect some of this DOM, I bet you will find some margin. And there we do, MY4 is margin top and bottom 4. So let's come to our template and see if we can find this. And I'm just going to replace this with padding. This is basically margin collapse getting in the way of some of Ember Animated's calculations. And now if we start back on the index and click a poster, it looks like that text is exactly where it's supposed to be. So I slowed this down. All that content is right there. It's fading in and the poster moves. So that's pretty cool. All right, next we actually want to fade in the rest of these elements, because if I click on one of these, we see that this black bar and the video controls kind of just appear. And so we want them to fade in as well. So let's work on that. Now, instead of kind of duplicating this animated value with this .fade and then defining this transition right here, let's go ahead and just wrap this in a component. So I'm just going to come up to our components directory and I'm going to create a new file, and we'll just make an animate component. It's just going to do one thing right now, but this way we can expand it later. And I'll define a component.js file as well as a template.hbs. And I'll come grab this fade transition right here. And in our component, we'll go ahead and paste this. We'll grab this import right here. And then if we come to where we're using this, we basically want to replace this with animate. And we want to be able to pass in a model. So let's give it a model argument and we'll pass in model, and we'll pre-wire this transition right here. So I'm just going to grab this, come over to our new template, drop this in, close that out, and we'll just yield the contents. And model is now an argument, so we can just use @model here. And so now let's come back to our template and we'll just grab animate and we'll close it off down here. And let's see how our new kind of domain specific animator component works. Here we are on the podcast page. Go back to the index, click on one of these, and it looks like everything's still working. So now we kind of have one animator component that's going to let us more easily reuse it on these other elements and tweak settings kind of in one place later on when we polish this animation a bit. So next, let's go ahead and animate in these controls right here. So I'm going to come to our UI Video Hero template, and way down at the bottom is where we render the controls. So I'm just going to come here and grab this. We have our animated container, and we have our new animate component. So we can just drop that like this. I like keeping the animated container outside of an animator component because sometimes you want it and sometimes you don't. And in this template, video is actually the model, but we still want this to match because again, we only want this to fire if there is a received sprite, and the UI Video Hero is used elsewhere on the site. So we don't want to affect those other pages. So let's save this and come check this out. We'll slow this down, click on a poster, and now we see the video controls fading in as well. Now it looks like there's some overlap happening right here. If I pause this poster is kind of behind these. I think we can fix that pretty quick. We'll just come to our episode page, or rather our video hero here, where we're actually moving the sprites. And before we move them, we can just call apply styles and go ahead and give them a z index of 1. So now with any luck, if we look at the actual poster that's moving, it should always kind of be in front of those elements behind. And it looks like it is. Pretty cool. All right, so next we want to go ahead and fade in the black background. And in our video hero component, if we come up here, we'll see that that comes from this class right here. And this is part of this div right here, which actually contains, if we scroll way down, our video player, which we've wrapped in this container and animated value. And so I've found the best results so far when working with kind of complex animations like this is to not nest animators. And so first what I'm going to do is just make it so that we can have this kind of background on its own, and that way we can wrap it in an animator. And this shouldn't be too bad. I think we can just say, let's get a div, and we can make it absolutely positioned and pinned and background true black. And I think as long as this is relative, we should have our black background. And it looks like we do. So now we should be able to come down and grab this animate component, and we'll just wrap that background right inside of it. And now if we go back to the index page, let's slow this down and click on a poster. All right, there we go. The background's now fading in. Now it's a little stark, and we'll address that in just a minute. But for now, the pieces are definitely working. So this is looking pretty cool, and we can kind of take a look at this on smaller screens and see how it looks. Most of the elements are working here. The last piece is, it looks like this play button is kind of hanging out right there as soon as we go to the page. And so that's kind of awkward. So hopefully we would be able to fade that in as well. So let's work on that next. Now I believe that one is inside of our video player. So if we open up the template for the video player, here we render the video component, and down here we have our play icon. So let's drop the animate component right here as well. And we need to give it a model. And it looks like if I look in this video player, we kind of have some data here, but I don't see an actual model. So let's come back to our video hero. We're rendering the video player right here. And I think it makes sense to pass in a video right here to the player. So I'll do that. I won't change anything else in case we're reusing this elsewhere on the site. But now we kind of have the notion of a model in our video player. So back in the template, we should be able to pass that in as video. And then we'll go ahead and close out animate. And so now if we start out on the index, slow this down. Okay, so there we have some interesting movement going on. And again, that is because this is a child of the animator that's already moving, but I think we can solve this kind of in a better way, a way that's going to improve the rest of the animation as well. So if we just kind of look at the existing elements, I'm going to comment that out for now. And we just take a look at what happens. If we look at this, we click on this, and there's just a lot happening at once. So I think a way to improve all of these elements right here is if they faded in after the video had already moved. And that would solve our problem with this play button moving as well. I think it's just the simplest approach to this. So let's go ahead and stagger these. Let's come to our kind of move motion. We'll grab the duration from the argument, and right here, we'll both move and resize these. Let's just say we take half of the duration to do that. And then in our animate component, we got our fade transition right here. We'll grab the duration. And we actually want to wait here for half the duration before we do all this work. So we can import wait from Ember Animated. And then we can kind of split this work up. So first we'll apply the styles here, move them to their final position, and then we'll yield a wait to duration times 0.5. So that will wait half the time. And then for each received sprites, we'll go ahead and fade them in. So let's save this and just give it a look. Start out on the index. Let's go ahead and slow this down. And that's looking pretty cool. So now there's a lot less happening if we're scrolling here and we click one of these. we kind of have the movement and then the fade. And so now if we come back to our video player template, we should be able to add this animate component back in. It's using the same transition, and so it is going to wait as well, just like all the rest of the elements. And so if we click on one of these, now we kind of have a nice effect. So the last thing I want to do here is, and it's kind of fun to look at this, on like a tablet size screen and see what everything looks like. And the last thing I want to do here is these default motions are a little bit stiff. They're not linear easing, but as we talked about kind of in the series, they are a pretty standard easing that doesn't have a lot of life in it. So we can really improve this animation if we change up the default easing just a little bit. So let's do that. We'll come back to our UI video component here. And in our move transition, we want to also pass in an easing here. And we're going to use the ease exp out. This is exponential easing out, which we can go ahead and import from the D3 ease package, which I've already installed. So as we talked about in the series, easings can just be functions that take a time and return a time. And because all the functions in D3 ease correspond to that interface, we can use them right here. So let's grab this and pop open our animate component, import this, and our fade, we'll go ahead and pass in an easing as well, ease exp out. Let's come back to the app and take a look. Start out on the podcast page. And even just that little change, you can see kind of how much life it adds to this motion. It's pretty cool how dramatic these easings are, and I haven't even experimented with a bunch of them, and they really just kind of change the whole feeling here. We can go back and forward here and see exactly what this will feel like, but I think this adds just a little bit of touch to this page. It's kind of fun. It looks pretty great on the big screen, and if we kind of shrink this down, everything works, even if we have this single grid. Ember Animated is doing all this calculation for us, and works with the back button, works with the forward button. And so this is pretty cool. There's a lot more we could do here. We could animate back. And, I think it's really fun to play around with this stuff. So hopefully you found that informative, a little bit inspiring, and maybe you have some ideas for how you can bring these great tools that we have with the Ember Animated library into your own apps.